For hundreds of years, we've seen men on the political stage, dominating our governments and how they're run. From never having a female or gender minority president, to women across the political stage being constantly doubted in their abilities and being held to a different standard, cis men have had control of the narrative through their upper hand in shaping the world as it is today. For hundreds of years, women have sought their opportunities to take place in front of the world, and for hundreds of years, they've been denied their chance. Our first president was George Washington. Anybody can tell you that. But can they tell you that Victoria Woodhull was the first woman to run for president back in 1872? Over 140 years later, she's been erased from the history books. Yet, she made history. Whether this is on the large political stage, in corporate environments, or just in daily life, women and gender minorities are experiencing the same issues today. So where do we see this divide originate? And where are many young people experiencing it today? One large place is high school speech and debate.
Generally, what we see is that women are more likely to be objectified within the space. So instead of being taken seriously for their intellect, they're more of, like talked about their physical appearances or things that are not necessarily like about our intellect whatsoever.
I, at the beginning of my career, thought that there was a certain amount of success that I could attain in order to be respected by these people. And the more successful I got, I sort of realized that that didn't exist.
There are two main problems and things that we see. The first is a complete lack of representation. So you see my junior year, when I debated at the Tournament of Champions, I did policy debate, but this is probably true across the board. We faced 14 debaters, and there was I debated one non-male opponent in the first round, and that's it.
Like, I would be in a lab that was like with just guys, and like they would talk to the person I was dating in high school and not talk to me. And like I would be known on the circuit as like this person's girlfriend rather than like myself, even though I won like many national tournaments. And I think there's this feeling of being an intruder in a space that wasn't built for you.
A microaggression that I remember experiencing as a young debater was when I was a freshman in high school. I just first started doing debate. I remember I was in a round and I was in a public forum round, and it was me and I had a female partner, and we were facing two male partners. And during green crossfire, like as I said something, I heard under his breath one of the male competitors call me the B word.
You have role models in the activity, but as a woman or a gender minority, you aren't associated with the good debaters that become idolized in the community. And you form your own support network against basically everybody else.
So just little things like that make women feel like their statements are invalid and essentially gaslighting women in rounds. Though that's unfortunately far more prevalent than I think a lot of people realize.
We are also excluded unintentionally or intentionally. I've personally had to deal with like the exclusion on my mostly male team, and a lot of the times it's unintentional, but there's also like very intentional and explicit forms of sexism that a lot of women in debate experience, especially because there's so little of us. Generally, people say that there are less women in the activity overarchingly, and there's also studies out there, I think, that show that women leave the activity at higher rates. And so there's a culture of men being the norm in debate, which is what makes it so hard for women to exist in this activity.
I don't know if it's been studied or not, but not only are female or like non-male presenting debaters more likely to be criticized for aggression, but they're also more likely to be punished for it. But on the flip side of that, if you are kind of like playing the victim, or if you are like more quiet or like quote unquote like less aggressive, there's also a negative connotation to that, because then you know have the guise of like looking like you're losing, or if you like play the victim mentality, then it just looks like they're winning the arguments, which also makes you more likely to lose. So it's kind of like how you kind of navigate that when in both scenarios you are getting like there's like a negative effect.
Definitely the objectification of like female debaters. We would always do our makeup, always spend money on clothes to look good. That was always something really important to us. We always felt like the judge wouldn't take us seriously, and nor would our like male counterparts take us seriously if we didn't look good and look professional, whatever that means. You know, because professionalism, I feel like, is kind of what people say just to kind of guise all of this sexism.
In general, the like large majority of teams who are celebrated in the debate world are like teams who are predominantly male. And when like female debaters are celebrated in the debate world, it's commonly as a, you know, they're the best girl team rather than they're the best team overall. For example, a few years ago, there's always a thing on like the debate Reddit every year for like debate superlatives. And like a few years ago, even there was like a superlative that was like best team. And then there was another one that was like best girl team. So it's always been like a separate category entirely to talk about like non-male teams in the context of debate, or talk about things in terms of gender when talking about good teams, but that's only for teams that are non-male.
Probably the most like explicitly like objectifying thing was just what male debaters would kind of say about us behind our backs, and we happened to discover it one day. So that was definitely a really painful moment and a really like eye-opening moment that shifted the way we saw our opponents.
I think one of my biggest insecurities in high school was that I was not a person worth listening to, and I was not a person that had anything valuable to say. And I think it's crazy in an activity where like all I was doing was speaking and thinking of things to say, but I think there's definitely this culture where women who are not successful and women who are successful are seen as other for trying and being in a place. And I think that sexual harassment really, really fits in with that, where there's this feeling of women sort of being there to be taken advantage of. And I don't want to just say women, because like absolutely women are not the only ones who experience like sexual harassment or sexual assault or sexual violence. And I think this culture like pervades, but I think there is a certain archetype of like very, very privileged debater who sort of sees other people as existing to be used. And I think that's one of the most like deeply disgusting and upsetting parts of the culture that makes a lot of people feel like this is not a space for me. Like, I don't know why I'm trying so hard to be in a place that doesn't want me.
People like to act like you suddenly don't know what you're doing when you're not some like super tall, rich, straight white man in debate. And it's really annoying because it's like, obviously I stayed in this space. I was hired by someone. Like, I'm not just here chilling for my health. I'm literally being paid to be here. So at what point did you come to the conclusion that I'm not qualified, or that I'm less qualified than you to do my job?
At times, I felt like either from the administration itself or from just other junior instructors that I was valued less as an instructor due to having like a less pristine like competitive record. My partner and I like didn't travel as much as a lot of other teams, so a lot of times whenever I was having like an argument about with someone about like something in debate of like, oh, you know, I think this is like the right way to do this or something like that, there were some people whose immediate reaction was just to discredit my opinion by saying that they were better than me at debate in high school. And so I think that that's a real dynamic that a lot of female coaches face, is kind of, since for a lot of reasons we're less likely to be successful, we're also more likely to be like diminished. Our opinions like as coaches are more likely to be like diminished.
And it heavily mirrors the way that people experience sexism in corporate environments. Actually, it's not very different at all. The same like assumptions that, you know, we should be quiet in certain spaces, or that we don't know what we're talking about, as I said earlier, and or that we're just so attached to our emotions that the positions that we read are going to be too personal and too passionate, like almost like narratives rather than an academic assertion of arguments. That does contribute to gender minorities leaving as adults too. Like they stay in for a few years and then they're like, oh yeah, I'm good. Like, or they definitely don't stay past college even.
There's a lot of sort of work that I've seen a lot of gender minority coaches do that just isn't expected of male coaches in the same way, cis straight male coaches, in terms of emotional support towards the people they coach, whether at camp or as a coach on a team. Just being expected to like make sure the kids eat, and I mean, that's something that I would do, right? Because it's basic decency, but there is definitely a difference in how men are expected to just sort of treat their students as like pure vehicles for victory, where they just like teach them and transmit information because they're so smart and so good at debate. And then female coaches are supposed to do all that and then also like sort of make sure they feel good about themselves and confident. I want to be very careful here because I don't want to accidentally say that people shouldn't be emotionally supportive, because I do think that's important, but it's that you do work that is not expected from other people and you're not being paid more for it.
One of my colleagues who ended up running Beyond Resolve the year after I did Yukiho, we interviewed a female coach when we were at a debate camp about her experiences, and she kind of touched on with something that's like very relatable to me, which is always having to do like the emotional labor in terms of like being a coach. The burden often falls on female coaches, or like in similar fields like coaches of color, or different other groups in debate, to like do the burden of kind of like fixing issues, or being the ones to introduce inclusivity, or being the ones to kind of like correct issues in the debate world, when that should not be true, and it should be a burden on every single educator who's in the community to like make the community a better place. There's kind of a dynamic of like female coaches also being tokenized in the activity, not only in terms of like hiring at camps, because a lot of camps will publish specific things being like, oh, we're hiring, we're making sure there's at least one female instructor in every lab, and then it just feels like they're only trying to hire female instructors to fill a quota. But then there's also a dynamic of kind of saying that a lot of like using that to say that female coaches are hired because they provide diversity rather than because they're actually like valued in terms of debate or like a good coach.
You often find that the same type of seriousness or like attentiveness isn't really given to gender minorities in these settings. I also though think specifically there are rounds where the decision, you've made your decision, you've given your decision, and you're giving your RFD, and that RFD can be interrupted by somebody, or suddenly the person is grilling you, asking you questions, and just going like above and beyond, as if you're supposed to take the time to put up with any of the disrespect from a high school student, but B, also put up with a level of interrogation that probably would not be happening if it was a male coach. That whole superiority complex that I think a lot of students have, especially the non-gender minority students. I definitely think that they have a level of disrespect that kind of gets normalized in some instances that I personally work to deconstruct at any chance that I get, because it's unacceptable.
I would say like with my friends also, like one of my friends who I worked at camp with got post-rounded after like almost every single round that she judged in the camp tournament by like children who were very like new to debate as well. Or like, this is not to say that she is like ineligible for making a bad decision, but like in this case, she was like much more qualified, and I also just don't think post-rounding is ever right. Like we were the only two female instructors, like junior instructors on the staff, and almost no one else got post-rounded except for like her and like occasionally me. And so I think that just in general, there's a lot more like backlash in terms of that. I think part of that also relates to the idea that like people distrust female coaches or female judges just in general. There's kind of the stereotype around like the mom judge versus like just calling the dad judge a parent judge. And so I think that there's kind of this also conception or like sexism involved with how people view lay judges, where they think like, oh, you know, it's a mom judge, which means that the judge is dumb, which is like very, very not true most of the time.
Well, as a female judge, male debaters have never treated me better. Like, as a judge, like, I feel like they're always so nice to me, like, love to hear my feedback, like, always being so polite to me because I'm the judge and they know I have the power and that I have the ballot. So it's really interesting to see how polite and truly kind male debaters can be. Because as a judge, like, I've just, like, never been treated better. But, like, I know some female judges have to deal with like men post-rounding them, like male debaters post-rounding them because they didn't think their ballot was like correct. I don't think I've ever experienced that, thankfully, yet, but I've only really been judging for like a year. But yeah, I've never been post-rounded. I feel like I'm just treated a lot better by male debaters now since I'm not their competitor. So I actually have had a lot more positive experiences as a coach, I think, than as a debater. Now I don't have to deal with like the competitive atmosphere anymore. I just get to deal with, you know, helping my students succeed. And so that's like a lot more, I guess, relaxing to me. So as a coach, I think it's been a lot more positive. But in terms of like the sexism aspect, on my team, I'm like the only female coach. And I think that like on my old high school's team, they just recently hired a female head coach, but before that they only had like a female assistant coach. And so I definitely think that there's just kind of like a shortage of like female coaches kind of available for students to learn from, because women end up doing debate and then literally leaving the second that they can, the second that they feel free. They never want to come back because of how negative their experiences are. You know, they definitely have a point, you know, like leaving an abusive environment when you have the chance is probably the best thing you could ever do for yourself. So I definitely like question myself sometimes, like, you know, it's kind of crazy that I've really stayed in this community for so long, but I don't regret it because I know that my value as a female coach in this community is actually like really like it's huge, right? Because there's just so little of us and we have such a different experience than male debaters. So it's important for like young girls to be able to like have like female coaches that they can go to talk about the things that they're experiencing and not, you know, have to deal with gaslighting or, oh, well, that's kind of weird. I've never like experienced that from like your male coaches, you know, that you sometimes get because they just don't know any better.
If I'm a young debater trying to see what the norm of debate is, I really want to see like the role models and see that people like me can succeed. So I guess this is not just a conversation about women, it is about all types of like diversity and types of people that we see in the debate space, which is just normally that the people that succeed are often maybe white or Asian, rich and privileged cis people, and it is not generally not a good representation for the people, for younger people that may not identify like the people that are succeeding.
I personally, last year, for example, had a student who came out to me as trans, and I know 100% that they would not have felt comfortable doing that if I wasn't like a Black woman and I wasn't as open and as like how I am as being an ally to the LGBTQ community and to like helping like build spaces for gender minorities in debate. And I also personally feel like, as we were talking about earlier, because the exit rate is so high, when people come, they're like, I don't see many of us here. I think that makes me uncomfortable. And, you know, it could be someone who's brilliant and they show up and they're like, well, I don't really feel like I have that much support. I don't really have anyone in my corner. All my judges are men. And just like, well, I don't really feel as comfortable anymore. And I don't think that that's invalid. Like, even I wouldn't necessarily want to go somewhere, even outside debate. Like, I wouldn't really want to go to a social setting where there weren't many women or gender minorities. Like, I wouldn't really want to be in that room. So it's weird that we kind of normalize it so much in debate.
Having those female role models is evidence of what powerful women can do whenever they are given a platform for speaking. I know for me, my mom was a huge role model for me in the speech and debate community. She encouraged me to try speaking events, and that was really important for me, because I might not have given those a try if she hadn't recognized some of the potential that I could have. You know, I might have just stuck to solely the funny events because that was what I was comfortable with. So I think we need female coaches to help push particularly female competitors into zones that they maybe aren't comfortable with, so that we can show the world how impactful they are and how they absolutely belong in those spaces.
I didn't have a female role model in this activity at all. My coaching staff was all male. The varsity debaters when I debated were all male. My novice class was some female, but everybody else quit. And it was sort of a lack of respect for female or gender minority competitors, and a very like bro culture, very toxic, very unhealthily competitive about who cared the least, who could put their opponents down the most. Random snide comments about like, oh, did you see this person we debated round X? They like didn't know what they were doing. Kind of hot though, like I would do her. Like that was stuff that I would hear like at dinner tables, like with my team or with my team and other teams throughout my debate career. And there was no real moderating influence for any of that behavior. My coach wasn't there. It was like a team dinner. There was no one really to change that. And when people would join the team, they would just sort of see that as the face of the team. Like I had my senior year, I had a lot of freshmen girls come up to me and were like, is the team really like bro-y? Like what's the vibe? And I mean, I had to be honest with them. I was like, yeah, this is what it's like. I'm working to change that. Like, please reach out to me. But it definitely put a lot of people off the activity, at least at my school. And this is a pretty shared experience, I would say.
Sort of on the opposite end of that. So my coach is she's female. She's our advisor. She's not like an official coach. She's more the teacher advisor. But I think having that sort of role model, even in her, even though she hasn't done debate and just sort of like sits there and helps us do the logistics of it all and like comes with us to tournaments, is really beneficial for me. I've definitely experienced the same sort of bro culture that Tara talks about in debate, especially with members of my own team, members of other teams, and this sort of ideal of like, it's okay because like you're a good debater, so you can do whatever you want, especially to women. And personally, I had experienced in my junior year a lot of harassment from a bunch of debaters at nearby all boys team near my school. So when that experience is happening to me, I think if I didn't have a sort of positive female role model as my advisor, if I didn't have somebody that I felt that I could talk to about this experience, somebody that wouldn't diminish my experiences, I think it would have been a lot worse for me, because ultimately I was able to speak to her. I spoke to her about what had happened with debaters from the other team. I talked to her about sort of my experience, and I was really able to feel like connected with somebody, and I felt like it was okay. Like these things, like the things they did weren't okay to me, but like I was still good. Like it wasn't my fault, it was theirs. And I think if I hadn't had a female role model, if I hadn't had my advisor to speak to, I think I would have been a lot more isolated and feeling a lot worse after the things that happened.
It's very strange because when women and gender minorities are so underrepresented in debate, it's when you win or do well, there's like this strange pressure to be like a standard bearer in the activity or to be a model for how women should be in the debate space. Like you should be reading feminism arguments, or you should be reading like identity positions, or you should be like taking a stand for all women. And I think having female coaches and role models who have a wide range of interests, a wide range of different argumentative styles, things like that, just helps sort of neutralize it. Like when you work with a female coach who's teaching you not feminist theory, I mean, yes, also great to learn feminist theory from a woman in debate, but it's also great to learn about something completely unrelated, like a policy position, or to learn about theory or whatever it is, because there's no longer this added dimension of feeling like there's some sort of insecurity or that you have to prove yourself in this space or that you're representing some sort of broader force. You're just sort of working with this teacher, as a debater. And I think it can just take a lot of the pressure off in a really interesting way. And I know I was really lucky to have really amazing coaches who were men, but I think they did a really good job because I had a lot of other women on my team at the time. I felt like I was really supported and able to just sort of explore and the literature and explore what I thought was interesting and not sort of have to worry about all these other questions of what it means to be a woman in debate. And that's very rare. That's not the typical experience, I think. So I think sort of being able to offer that to younger debaters is really important.
I've been talking to a lot of my friends about the experiences that AOC had with Ted Yoho.
2 days ago, I was walking up the steps of the Capitol when Representative Yoho suddenly turned a corner, and he was accompanied by Representative Roger Williams, and accosted me on the steps right here in front of our nation's Capitol. I was minding my own business, walking up the steps, and Representative Yoho put his finger in my face. He called me disgusting. He called me crazy. He called me out of my mind. And he called me dangerous. And then he took a few more steps, and after I had recognized his comments as rude, he walked away and said, "I'm rude. You're calling me rude." I walked back out, and there were reporters in the front of the Capitol. And in front of reporters, Representative Yoho called me, and I quote, "a fucking bitch."
And I think the idea of like a powerful woman in a space who's advocating for justice, being called a bitch to her face is something that is not surprising to anyone in the speech and debate community. Like, I think I can't imagine any successful woman who would be surprised to hear that men were calling her a bitch behind her back or maybe even to her face. And I think that a lot of people talk about also the culture of hero worshiping in high school debate, which is this feeling that there are certain debaters that are good enough and they can get away with anything. And I think that that idea sort of pervades politics as well, in a way that I'm not surprised that there is this pervasive nature of sexual harassment and sexual assault and bigotry in politics in a similar way as there seems to be in high school debate.
I think you also get a similar thing that what Nina and I were speaking about in terms of like somebody being worth like the opinions that we think are worth listening to and the opinions that we think that people deserve the right to speak on. I'm most reminded about this by like the experience gap between Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg in the Democratic primary.
Do you think there's a gendered issue here in terms of people not seeing you as the person to get it done?
Okay, well, I have said this clearly in that last debate, the CNN debate, that I do think there's a double standard. Now, that doesn't mean that he is not qualified. He is. But do I think that a woman who had lost the statewide race, lost the race for the DNC, was a mayor of a small town, would be able to be the candidate to head up our ticket? I don't. But that's not my problem. My problem is convincing America that I can be that person.
The quote-unquote media, whoever that is, decided that Pete Buttigieg's values, opinions, candidacy was more serious despite his lack of experience. And you saw that on the debate stage. You saw that play out on the presidential debates, but then it was knocked off in favor of Pete Buttigieg's wine cave and Amy Klobuchar being mean. I think you see this really often in really any powerful woman, like being mean or bitchy, whereas a man, they would be so strong, steadfast, leader, etc.
I definitely think that a lot of those microaggressions are prevalent in the business world and also in just professional world in general. But beyond microaggressions, I think there's also this implicit bias that we this standard that we unconsciously hold women to, particularly when they are speaking or in a position of leadership, that puts them in a double bind where they're, we expect them to be tough. We don't want them to be too emotional, but we also expect them at the same time to not be too masculine and too bossy. So I think that just being aware of that implicit bias and how that extends far beyond the speech and debate world, that impacts women who are on the news, that impacts women who are in politics, that affects literally every woman who's in a position of leadership, and the way that people perceive her. I definitely think that it is a really prevalent issue within our society.
Welcome to the second presidential debate. Secretary Clinton, knowing that educators assign viewing the debates as homework, do you feel you're modeling appropriate behavior for today's youth? Well, thank you. I think that's a very good question. Be wrong. Because, thank you, Secretary Clinton, you're out of time. Being a female debater, I get interrupted all the time. All right, next question. Secretary Clinton, do you believe you can be a devoted president to all the people of the United States? First and foremost, I will do everything I can. No reach, wrong. Why don't you interrupt her? You interrupt me all the time.
The connection that I was trying to show there was just how people were very critical of Clinton, in terms of they would say, oh, she interrupts him all the time. And he would talk about, Trump would talk about how much she interrupted him. When really, if you look at statistically, the number of times that he interrupted her versus how many times she interrupted him, the numbers are just not even close in terms of how many times he interrupted her. But that's just kind of the societal standard, that's not something that we're really aware of or we criticize because that's what we expect. We expect women to submit, generally speaking, to the other person if the other person starts talking. So that was just one example of how I think these implicit biases manifest within the political election. And then also, I was trying to tie how people perceived her and their expectations of her with some of the expectations that we have of women in the speech and debate community. Because I think that double bind situation definitely applies of it's almost a no-win in terms of what people want from you. You're never going to be able to make everyone happy.
I think, as we said earlier, the analogy of the lack of respect for gender minorities, and that's a lot of things. It means lack of respect for their presence or their time or their mental and emotional health. All of those things definitely manifest themselves in the business world, in the corporate world, in some sense. I definitely don't think that we are immune to these things. If anything, I actually think that debate is a great preparation for that world, because so many of the microaggressions that you'll experience in terms of like people criticizing your clothes, people criticizing the octave that your voice is at, people criticizing your emotional state at tournaments, people criticizing or overly sexualizing you or harassing you. Those are all things that have happened in these spaces, and that you either know someone has experienced that or you have personally experienced by the time that you graduate from high school and or after a few years of judging. If a student, for example, has come up to you and made some type of report that indicates that. So I think that it's very, very analogous.
I'm sort of just thinking, I'm thinking about the corporate sort of analogy, and I think it's again a weird thing of like both things really just, if you just think about like what both environments value, what both environments care about, like professionalism, we've talked about a bit, and we've talked about these double standards, but also just like time even, and this like ability to just be like very single-minded. They're expecting you to give so much to be successful. and probably too much. And they already have a very competitive structure where like it's sort of zero sum, right? Like someone wins and someone loses, or in a corporate environment, like, you know, someone gets the promotion, someone doesn't. In those types of environments, it's just really harmful when it's already, if it's already toxic or already sexist and all these things, then it's just even harder when you ask gender minorities to like put in that amount of hours into a harmful space. So both things sort of are cyclical in that way, where they drive people out of like, there are plenty of people interested in the corporate world, there are plenty of people interested in debate, whatever, but when you get to the highest levels, that's where you see the biggest disparities, because people are not willing to stay in a toxic environment.
I think another thing that's kind of strangely similar is also the lack of responsibility for it, the lack of culpability. Like, there isn't really one entity that is like, all right, yeah, I'm gonna investigate them. There's no HR at debate tournaments. There's no HR at these camps. So it's like, you can go to the administrators at camp and say something, and usually it'll get investigated. But if you're at a debate tournament, and especially if you don't see anything once it happens, if you like wait and you complain, it's over with. There's no one's gonna address that. That's a past issue. And sometimes people go out of their way to silence people from saying anything about it. And that's another issue that you see in the corporate world as well, is people creating an incentive to not say anything, rather the incentive to speak out and let people know that X person is dangerous to be around, or X person should not be allowed at tournaments with high school children walking around and middle school children walking around. Like, there's some people that I personally think should literally be barred from tournaments. And that's like, that norm, I just don't think is there yet. The norm of just being like, no, this person should not come, or like, we should alert tournaments. I know that there have been some people, like one woman, like recently on the Facebook LD group, that made it very clear that she like does call tournaments explicitly and lets them know like, X person has had X accusations, or this thing has happened with them. I don't think you should invite them to your tournament. And in that case, I think that type of stuff is praxis. Like, that's what we should be doing on a larger level, because that's the closest thing that we'll have to an HR for us.
Think about like the workforce. It's definitely male dominated because men kind of like created the workforce, right? Like what the workforce is in society. Like patriarchy built that and built that idea. And, you know, women weren't in the workforce. Like, we were barred from the workforce for years. So in that same way, it's kind of a male dominated space, like the same way debate is. So I think that the like impacts, the sexist experiences that you have in a male dominated extracurricular will affect all of your experiences in any other male dominated area of your life from then on. And I think the workplace is even more similar, like to debate than like just being male dominated. It's definitely like kind of teaches you how to be a professional person, like doing debate. So I think that the impacts can definitely carry over, and definitely do. You see that probably like most famously in politics. You know, Elizabeth Warren did debate in high school. And a lot of other famous politicians also did debate in high school. Ted Cruz did debate in high school and college. So I think that it's kind of interesting to see those themes echo in politics, where women are like literally it's literally they're treated the exact same way that female debaters are treated. It's actually weird. Like, it's literally so weird how it's the exact same, like literally the exact same thing. Like, they're critiqued for how they look. They're critiqued for their delivery instead of the content of what they're delivering. They're critiqued for basically anything anyone can find. That's like literally American politics, and also like American extracurricular debate.
A really good solution is just sort of in the individual level. Like, you need to think about what you've done in debate and what you've done to other people, and really reassess the way you're sort of viewing women, especially in debate. So personally, like, I previously had published an article about the harassment that I faced in debate. And I saw that as soon as people read the article and actually like saw how what they'd done impacted me, they immediately were like, oh shoot, like this was a problem. I need to stop doing that. I need to stop thinking of people this way. I need to stop thinking that this is like okay behavior. So I think even on the most individual level, what Speech and Debate Stories does, just by publicizing the stories, just by making them have this broader outreach to different communities, allows people to realize like what I'm doing isn't harmless. There is a problem that is happening, and on an individual level, I need to call out my friends that are doing stuff like this. I need to make sure that I'm not treating women as objects or treating them as if they aren't as good in debate. And then I also need to make sure that I'm able to support my friends and my the people around me that speak out about these issues. And I think that just in the first place, like making it clear that there is an issue that is happening is what's going to get people to make their individual change.
Yeah, what Nikki was saying, and like we all have a role in this, and it's up to us to decide what that role is going to be. Is it going to be that I'm a bystander, an enabler, or someone who's making change? And it's a choice. And I mean, I hope that we all choose to make change.
I think the first thing kind of gets back to the issue of role models and making sure that we have women in positions of leadership on speech teams, and particularly women who are in positions of leadership on the debate and public speaking side of things, because there needs to be more visibility of women within those spaces, and also having, female coaches for teams. I think that's really important for encouraging inclusivity within the debate space.
I think in a lot of ways, right? One of them is just being able to personally recognize the privilege that each of us have. So even if you identify as a marginalized folk, there are privileges that you hold in other areas that you probably don't recognize because privilege is invisible for those that have it. So recognizing that and being an active ally to the communities that maybe you have forgotten about, and having discussions about how to be an active ally is something that's very, very important, because I think a lot of the times people in the community or people in this activity know that they want a good environment for everyone, but they don't necessarily know how to promote that kind of environment and be a good ally. So being a good ally, first of all, is the main thing that everyone should strive to do within this activity. But the other thing, I guess, is sort of another thing that I wrote about in my goodbye message was that don't let all the marginalized folk do the work in terms of changing the activity structurally, just because there's just so much that each one of us can do in terms of changing the activity, talking to our coaches and the people that are in power. A lot of the times they can foster the change in the long term, because if they understand what the problems with the environment are now, they can try to amend that in the long term and make sure that they're doing things within their team or camp or tournaments to make sure that these environments are not being fostered anymore. So yeah, I think it is a combination of awareness and better activism and better allies that's going to be really, really important moving forward.
I personally will say that I think Women in Debate is a great start. I think it's very nationally recognized now. You'll hear people even bringing it up as arguments in tournaments and stuff like that. I do think that the work needs to be done to be more intersectional. I think that even when we have spaces of for example, you'll go to a woman and gender minority inclusion meeting, and it tends to be a lot of rich, white, and East Asian women making their claims on things that they've experienced or what could be changed in the space, but you see that poor women and also Black and brown women, Black and Latinx, Native women, if there are many gender minorities in general, just don't feel like that space fits them or that space matches their experiences in a way that makes them want to speak out in those spaces. And I think that pushing for more intersectionality with finding and just keeping around more gender minorities of color and more gender minorities who come from different socioeconomic backgrounds is really important, especially socioeconomic background, because debate is something that is so predicated on you having access to resources. It's actually scary how privatized debate is becoming. So having those spaces where people understand what it's like to come from a class struggle is very important, I think, and making tournaments and debate education in general more accessible is obviously always the first step, because that's one thing that locks people out of the ranks. Like, you don't feel like you're supposed to be there because of your identity, but then you really can't even afford to be there because of your identity. So you're pushed out either way. And education, nonprofit debate camps like Texas Debate Collective, which I worked at, and that we always had partnerships with, and just debate camps where that you can trust the administration and trust the people who own it. You need to establish people in places of power that are actually trustworthy and are willing to do the work to make students feel safer. Otherwise, none of it's gonna work. And same thing at tournaments. I personally think should be someone in the tab room at tournaments who is willing to hear student complaints and not brush them off as something irrelevant because it doesn't affect the competition. Because at the end of the day, these are educational spaces. These tournaments almost always are happening at schools. So it's like, you all have an obligation as an educational space to make sure that students aren't experiencing violence in ways that hinder their ability to participate in the activity and or actively cause them to quit the activity at that tournament or after that tournament, because I've seen that happen too. So education, people in power who are trustworthy and who are willing to do this work, and then tournaments having someone who's less, just straight, I'm going to run the competition, straight administrator, and more like a personal kind of, not really HR, but like a person like that you can go to.
Yeah, completely. I don't know how many other tangible solutions I have off the top of my head besides that. But yeah, I just want to super reiterate Jay's point about access. It benefits everyone. For example, if formal clothes aren't a norm in debate, it benefits gender minorities who then aren't judged based on their sort of presentation, even though obviously there's always going to be some of that. It's hard to escape, but just norms like that of just sort of analyzing what affects people and sort of wondering why they're necessary and what things are just sort of left over. And yeah, just questioning that. And I think team culture matters a lot. Having teams, honestly, just having more teams that are at public schools, more teams in poor public schools, are super important. So much of the conversation is still so focused on that, how many women are in elims and things like that. And yes, I want to see more women in elims, but in 7 years of being in the Northeast, going to these same tournaments year after year, it's always the same. It's always 2 in quarters or whatever it is, or 1, if that, right? And that hopefully changes. But I think in terms of prioritization, there should be a lot more discussion on just how can you get people to sort of get an enjoyable experience out of debate, not have terrible experiences where they quit, and sort of just learn stuff. I think that would be that should be the primary goal of these sorts of initiatives.
I also forgot to add, but something really important that actually was pointed out to me while at a tournament is having tournaments that have gender neutral restrooms. I think that this is hard because a lot of the school itself is not something that changes, when you're having a tournament there. You can't just suddenly decide that this school needs to build a gender neutral restroom or something, but just having those more accessible, especially when we're on college campuses. I know there are a lot of college campuses around the country that have gender neutral restrooms, and that is something that has been, that's a complaint that I've heard. And, as a cisgendered woman, that's not something that I necessarily immediately pay attention to, but it's something that needs to be addressed when students feel like they can't go to a restroom that matches their gender identity. Or if there is one, it's 20 minutes away from where the competition is happening. So definitely another thing that could be thought about.
And I also don't really see why you couldn't, for example, just put a new sign over one of the restrooms, right? Even if you're at a public school that doesn't have gender neutral restrooms, or use a faculty restroom, just repurpose it for the weekend. There are a lot of very small things that can be done like that. And access to sanitary products in in all bathrooms and things like that, I think matter a lot as well.
I think the solution, and I know a lot of girls in debate don't want to hear it, but I think the solution is to just stay in debate. Stay in debate, keep going to tournaments, keep researching, keep practicing your public speaking skills, keep writing cases, and just keep killing it. If you just keep practicing and keep being in this activity, you're going to keep holding space for women in debate. Yeah, like that's like the only solution like I think that women in debate can implement like themselves on an individual level, you know? In terms of like solutions on a non-individual level, I think judge training, telling them check your bias at the door, don't comment on this, like, you know, comment on this instead. This is what you should be focusing on, not this, you know? Those, like, just letting judges, like, be aware that that's the standard. I think that will allow them to you know, then realize, you know, oh, maybe I'm being sexist if I focus on this. They'll have that in the back of their mind, always checking them while they're making a decision. So I think that that's actually one of the most effective ways to help with judge bias. In terms of male debaters, like themselves, I think working to dismantle patriarchy in society is going to bleed over into debate. I think that the male debaters that want to make a change and want to make women feel welcome in this space do make women feel welcome in this space and do what they can. I think that, like, you know, if they want to know, like, what they can individually do, like, to help, I guess, you know, just check your male peers. Like, don't let your male friends get away with things, because that's honestly, like, seeing your friend, like your friend giving you that confidence is what's going to enable you to continue that behavior. But if your friend, like someone you trust, like is like, oh wait, no, that's like weird, that's not cool, that's not funny, like doesn't laugh at your sexist joke, doesn't engage in that sexist commentary, that sets an example. Like, I'm not saying you have to be like the most perfect, like, you know, I guess feminist man, but just being nice and welcoming and smiling and shaking hands and being polite in Crossfire, and, you know, like having good energy and good vibes, like in a room, like being ready to make friends with your opponents after the round, right? Like those type, like regardless of their gender, make them your friends, like approach them as if you're approaching a friend, and think of them in that way. Like, make it a welcoming space. Like that's all that male debaters have to do. Because I mean, there's so many of them. I mean, imagine if, like, you know, like all male debaters all of a sudden just like started like incorporating their female like teammates into their conversations and into their prep groups and into their Google folders, you know, like that would create such a huge change and actually make women feel welcome in the space. It's not hard to make people feel welcome. You just need to be conscious of it. You need to be conscious that that's a goal of yours. And you need to want to make friends with them. You need to want to, like, you need to see them as a person, right? And then want to make friends with them because they are a person just like you.
I think like a couple of things, in my mind, at least right now, I think one is like more top level support for a lot of changes, because I think that like there's been a lot of support comparatively on like a grassroots level or from students for top level organizations like tournaments, like the NSDA, like a lot of other organizations to actually to like take action. And so I think tournaments, you know, requiring judge training, providing a like DEIJ coordinator on campus to like handle some of the stuff that happens, that it isn't inevitably going to happen, having like a mental health professional there as well, because a lot of students, their like anxiety or like a lot of other mental illnesses are very closely like tied to a debate because of the way that the activity like is. And so I think having that is definitely a necessary thing to happen. I think right now the debate community is somewhat responsive in the way that we handle a lot of issues of inclusivity, meaning when someone kind of makes a complaint, that's when we actually, I don't know if we invest resources when someone makes a complaint, but generally if something actually happens, it's after something bad happens, and then a tournament is like, oh dang, we have this issue, how do we solve it? I think that the debate community needs to move to be more like preventative, or like expect that issues are going to arise with regards to inclusivity, whether it be like on the basis of like race, gender, like socioeconomic class, or like people who may have like disabilities or mental health challenges. I think the community should expect that those things will happen, and have someone who is prepared to like A, try to prevent them from happening by having more inclusive practices, and B, have like be able to actually handle it, rather than kind of having the like emergency situation where the tournament's like, how do we handle this? I think implicit bias training has been really important, and like camps also improving a lot of their dynamics has been very important, because I think that a lot of like the habits in debate have been shaped by debate camps, specifically along the lines of gender, or at least like there was kind of a correlation between gender-based issues with kind of the rise of like debate camp culture in like the Kowalik study. And so I think having debate camps be both more accountable for how they have changed the landscape of debate, but also being more like willing to change and more willing to promote inclusivity, not only in their like individual sessions for inclusivity during camp, but also like camp wide. So, you know, hiring like a DEIJ coordinator to handle things, among like a bunch of other things that I am definitely just not like qualified to speak about in terms of like how camps should like improve in general. But I think like that would be like a really good first step, is to like focus more on inclusivity, not only in like a single day's activity, but throughout the camp as a whole, and have someone there who's like willing and able to address that. I know that a lot of camps have like moved in that direction, but I think that like there needs to be like more moves forward, or that all of them need to move in that direction.
I think one of the biggest problems is hiring practices. So the way that hiring works, like there aren't job applications that exist on a website that people can fill out. There aren't tests of people's teaching capabilities. Like it's really just your accomplishments as a debater. And I think it's really important to recognize being good at debate does not make you a good teacher, and it does not make you someone that is safe to have around children or safe to have around other staff members. And so I think the first thing is radically rethinking the hiring process. So I think hiring should be something that is transparent. There should be applications that are available to everyone. There should be written applications. There should be a requirement that people submit references. There should be interviews or like samples of individuals teaching to ensure that they are someone who would be good to like lead lessons and be responsible. I think the second thing is communication between camps. So I think everyone, when I say someone left camp for a family emergency, is going to know what that means. But camps don't tell anyone that someone left for a family emergency, which is like code for misconduct. And so that person gets hired by another camp. And so I think this lack of accountability between camps allows perpetrators to circle around throughout the activity. I think the third thing is the culture within camps themselves. I think some camps are better about this, some camps are worse about this. There are camps that are primarily like everyone in a leadership position is a white man. And so I think it should come as no surprise to anyone that these camps are like not safe spaces to be a woman, to be a woman of color, to be Black. And so I think changing who is in leadership positions at these camps is incredibly important. And thinking really, really critically about the practices that you have. So I've taught at camps where I'm the only woman, and I'm with like older men who are pressuring me to drink with them. Like this was when I was 19. Like that is not a safe space. Like I felt incredibly preyed upon. I was not happy with it. I didn't feel that I had a choice to say no. And so I think once we change who's in a position of leadership and start thinking about well-being rather than just like, there are no rules, like we're just getting a lot of people that are good at debate together, I think that is a really important first step. I think there's a lot more work to do, but I think that all of that is necessary to even have a chance at these camps being a safe space.
A couple of other like top level reforms that I can think of. First, like having more diverse like tabbing staffs as well, in terms of like what like the community as a whole / like Beyond Resolved can do in the future. I think that Beyond Resolved is kind of like on a like good track right now to in terms of like trying to expand out to like other issues, trying to support more groups of people in debate. But I think that there needs to be like more support going forward. Like I think that the part of the like great thing about Beyond Resolved is that it's student run, which means that it's very focused on things that are important to students, but there are a lot of things that we are just like not qualified to handle. And I think that that was always my concern when running the organization, is like, what can we do without stretching ourselves too thin? Because the worst thing to do is to like, the worst thing to do in my mind is to like try to do something and like fail miserably or end up making things worse because we don't actually have the adequate support to do it. And so I think part of Beyond Resolved going forward needs to be having like more support from upper levels of the community in terms of like handling stuff that tends to be like more tricky, like how much should the website like censor things, or like what should be on the website, you know, how can we handle, you know, issues of how could we handle complicated issues when we don't have the expertise to do so, or how can we handle complicated issues when we don't have like enough diversity in terms of like who's working in Beyond Resolved, or we don't have that kind of like education and expertise to like take accountability for trying to solve like big issues both in the debate community and in general. And that's not to say that I don't think Beyond Resolved has done like a very, very good job at handling new issues. I just think that that's something that like not only like I want, but also that Beyond Resolved wants going forward, is like more support coming from like adults or coming from people who are like more qualified than we are, so that we can make our solutions like even better and make them more sustainable in the future, because it's very, very challenging at the moment to like run Beyond Resolved, especially as it's expanded. And I think that there needs to be like more support going forward, so that we're able to like maintain the like same rate of expansion that we've been able to maintain before.
Our group is doing a lot of work to put pressure on the National Speech and Debate Association. I think one of the huge problems with high school speech and debate is that it's basically an anarchy where there's no one who really has the authority to regulate other people. And so I think in part what we need is a leader to say, this is behavior that is not acceptable. This is behavior that we do not welcome in our space. We care more about the health and safety and well-being of our participants than your bid count, because that is not how debate is now. Like, there are people and they are successful, and because they are successful, how good they are as a person just doesn't matter. And so I think the first step is, as a community, saying there are certain things that are more important than how good you are at debate. And if you are a bad person, you are not welcome here. And I think the NSDA establishing what we've demanded, an accreditation system for camps, for judges, for coaches, for tournaments, establishing a reporting system, discussing as a community norms to be a good coach, to be a good school, to create a welcoming community writ large. I think that's the first step, because the way debate is set up is that if you got a lot of bids, you will be hired at a camp. You will not be necessarily background checked. You will not necessarily complete an interview. No one will ask about your qualities as a person. And so I think shifting to say, this is a huge problem, and as a community, we need to take responsibility to solve it.
Policy needs to be proactive if we're really going to make significant impacts. You know, so organizations that are really big within the speech community, like the NSDA, or, you know, those big national influences, and I know that they're making really good strides right now. They need to be actively making policies and implementing attitudes within like judging pools that are going to be conducive to inclusivity. And that's a trend that I think is happening right now, which I'm really glad that we're seeing that push for inclusivity, and specifically within policies.
I think it's hard, and this might be an unpopular opinion, but I think it's actually hard to call on the NSDA to do things about this, because realistically, even though technically all these national tournaments we're going to are under the umbrella of the National Speech and Debate Association, the NSDA is not very heavily involved in these things at all. I personally think that it would be good for them to have investigations into these people, and also maybe not necessarily have like a blacklist of people who can't show up to tournaments, but have something that's more publicized on like some people that shouldn't necessarily be invited to tournaments to judge and shouldn't be allowed on these campuses and stuff like that. I think that those are things that are definitely relevant and that are within the NSDA's control to disperse.
This is an issue that I feel like requires so much thought, and I'm so grateful that a lot of people are doing that thinking. But it's really hard for me to just say, here are 5 things the NSDA must do right now. But I certainly think, I just hope that all the coaches who have so much power in the activity are really taking these things seriously and are interested in sort of hearing out what younger people in the community have to say.
Obviously, like encouraging like more diversity in terms of like both the NSDA like board level and just like people who are involved in the NSDA, and having like more diverse coaches. But at the same time, I think like there needs to also be implementations to like help those coaches, because I think sometimes when people hire people who are diverse, it's more of just a like performative action of saying like, oh, we're going to hire this person to handle this, and then they don't actually pay attention to what that person says or don't actually value that person as much as other contributors. And so I think there has to be like more like back level reform to actually like accommodate for new practices that are more inclusive. Obviously, there's also the issue that the NSDA definitely needs to deal with like gender-based violence in the community, specifically with regards to like the prevalence of like predatory behaviors, as well as like sexual assault and sexual violence within the debate community. That's definitely something that I think that the NSDA, first of all, needs to address, and second of all, needs to like handle long term.
Well, I think that if, as an organization, the NSDA has a lot of money, right? So I guess they could probably put their money where their mouth is if they really do support female debaters, and invest in maybe all-girls schools that have debate teams, or, you know, women-only tournaments that have been popping up, like invest in those. Like they could start bias campaigns like on social media. They could have a part of their website, like they could use a part of their website to just maybe highlight female debaters and their success, or just have a column that they write weekly about diversity in debate. A friend of mine, Alan Abbott, did a study on female debaters and male debaters and kind of like sexism in debate and how it actually manifests in records. Maybe NSDA could do things like that every single year and actually measure the improvement. Like they could start tracking this type of stuff so people realize that it's real. Because a lot of times, like, we're all talking about it, we all feel like it's real, but people who don't feel like it's real, they don't see it, they don't understand it unless there's hard, like, evidence in front of them. So the NSDA could definitely use their resources to track that. The topic committee, they could put more women on the topic committee, more people of color on the topic committee. Like for the NSDA national tournament, they could go out of their way to like find women judges, and they could try to make it 50-50, or have certain quotas that they fulfill. There's a lot of things that they could do, I think.
I mean, like, just the golden rule, like, do unto others as you would want done unto you. It's not that difficult, people. And just try and take stock of what you're doing. Like, throughout this whole process, I realized that I probably participated in some enabling behaviors, and I don't like thinking of myself that way. But it was hard, and it was necessary for me to do as much as I can now to try and create the change that I want in the world.
The first thing is really try to listen, because I am certain that if people who have these biases genuinely listened to women, that they would recognize how important and integral women are to these spaces, and they would recognize that they absolutely deserve to be there. I think that's the biggest thing, is just please listen to women when they're speaking and when they're sharing their experiences with you. But then also I would encourage them to take active steps to try to overcome their inherent biases, and this goes for everyone. Everyone has inherent biases in terms of this. Sometimes even women will tone police other women. And that, being aware of our biases, I think is the first step to solving them.
I don't know if I have anything other than stop. But yeah, that's basically, stop. Also, just like, it's okay to admit that you did something wrong and then to change it. I think it's very freeing to not think that you have to be perfect. And I think being fine admitting that you did something wrong and then apologizing for it and like doing your best to actually work towards solving it, rather than just sort of digging in your heels and developing sort of the us versus them mentality. Because I think it's very easy for people to be like, when they're called out for their response, to just be like, sort of close ranks around their friends and just be like, well, me and my friends are actually good people, so please don't criticize us, and then never admit change. And I think that's sort of harmful.
Two things. One is
a lot of these discrepancies and a lot of these, I guess, striations at tournaments really heavily show on people's friend groups. Like, if you don't have friends from diverse identity backgrounds, then you're less likely to A, acknowledge your privilege, and B, be in spaces where you have to constantly interrogate that privilege and make spaces more inclusive. So I personally would say, like, just being nicer at tournaments and being more inviting and being more open to making friends and to keeping friends who differ from your identity is really important. I also think things that we need to normalize is like asking for pronouns and rounds and just making sure that those pronouns are respected, because I've been judging rounds where people have been misgendered, and those are things that matter a lot to students, especially if debate is the only space that they have to actually express their gender identity, which is the case for a lot of students, actually, surprisingly. Not that surprisingly, really, because the world that we live in is one that definitely has its issues with anti-queer violence, but I definitely think that debate is one of those spaces where students literally feel safe. Like, they come wearing clothes that they feel match their gender identity better, or they actually share their pronouns and they're not having to like go by a dead name or go by old pronouns or anything like that. Like, those are all things that we want to help feel inclusive about. So, and I think that also comes from what Zoe was saying earlier about like formal wear at tournaments. It's just like a question of like what students can access. So I would say, yeah, just not being so judgmental, whether it be like what a student's wearing or what their pronouns are, or like what their hair looks like or something, and not judging someone and what arguments they're going to read based on their identity, because that's happened a lot as well. Like, people will be like, oh, this Black person, great, they're going to read Afro-pessimism, or they have to read something about anti-Blackness, they're not going to read anything else. Or like, it's a woman, okay, yeah, she's probably going to read this Femme K or something like that. Like, why do you assume that? And, you know, people don't have to be just their identity. You know, we are human, we are a multiplicity, right? We aren't just like this one thing. You don't just look at me and be like, I'm a Black woman, that's it. Like, is that it? And it doesn't have to be in a lot of these cases. So I do think that kind of reminding people that we are people and not just like robots. We have lives outside of these tournaments. We have feelings in these tournaments. we have expectations for people to treat you like with respect at tournaments. All those things I think you have to keep in mind when you're caring for people, when you're around people at tournaments. I think just being more caring, just being more open, more calm. I think because people also get really riled up at these tournaments and they get really disrespectful, and it's like, I don't know who you thought you were talking to, but we're in this space and we're supposed to be the adults here, especially as judges. Like, we're supposed to be setting a good example for students. So also making sure that we have an appropriate behavior as adults is really important.
I think that there's literally no evidence. There's no evidence to support the beliefs that women aren't just as competent as men. Like, there's nothing. I guess, like, my advice to them is to read, specifically feminist literature. I'm currently reading The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. It is absolutely fascinating. I think challenge your beliefs, question your beliefs if you think that way. And the best way to do that literally is to read. So that's my best advice. Literally read a book. Like, read a book that a woman wrote and then come and tell me that that women are dumb, because you'll be changed by then. Like, books change you. And I mean, as a debater, you know, you're used to researching. So do research, do the right research, you know, like, question your beliefs, read books, read stuff written by women, read stuff written by Black women, watch Black is King by Beyonce, question your beliefs, and you'll be good. Like, I feel like literally anybody, like any man, can come to the light and realize, you know, that we're all the same. Like, we're literally all humans. Like, it's actually insane, like, how, like, we see women and men as so different when we're literally the same species. Like, we're actually exactly the same, like almost exactly the same. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's so simple. It's a simple truth that has gone ignored.
Read, listen. Like, when people are hurting, listen to them. Take that seriously. Don't be dismissive. Like, read through the entirety of our page. Read through the entirety of Speaking Up Safely. I mean, this is just speaking about, like, debate specifically. I think there's a lot of really interesting literature about debate specifically that exists within college policy. So like read Shinar, read Brinkley, watch like college policy rounds. Like I think when you listen to people and you take them seriously and you think about how you're complicit from a position of trying to be better rather than trying to alleviate your own guilt, I think that uncomfortable space where we think about how we can all be better is where real change happens.
It's okay to admit that you're wrong. It's okay to change your opinion on things. I know a lot of people who used to think that way, or used to, hate beyond resolved, or hate kind of the idea that like social justice in the debate world is becoming more of a big thing. I think also that a lot of times people associate ideas of inclusivity with kind of the culture that, like liberals are just so sensitive or whatever. But I think that this is not really a political issue. It's more of like a respectability issue, and it's very easy for you to change your behavior in the future to like hurt less people. It's important to take a step back and realize that your words have like meaning, and your words can hurt someone even if it's not intentional, and you should be kind of held accountable for your actions regardless of like what your intentions are in the situation. So I think like being more like palleable in terms of like how you change your behavior in response to criticism is also like really important in terms of like learning how to be not only like a better debater but also like a better person.
Don't. We are just as capable and intelligent as anyone else who joins this activity regardless of what we see in terms of like representation, and to treat us any differently is very, very bad. The Unresolved may not be perfect in terms of its diversity and what we accomplished, but I also think there is a huge issue of like the pressure of becoming the perfect ally within this activity. And I also want to add the message that like it's okay if you're not the perfect ally. We're all learning, and it is a learning process of becoming better in terms of like how we act within the community.
Please email your coaches, talk to your coaches, if your coaches run camps, talk to the people running camps, talk to trusted adults. We need y'all.
Tell your parents. Like if parents found out about this, they would be so mad. Like we need mad parents that have law backgrounds, that have journalism backgrounds, that have like power to be like, I'm gonna pull my kid from debate. I'm gonna pull everyone else's kid from debate. I'm gonna maybe sue you. I'm gonna maybe contact journalists. Like we need parents to know, because they have way, way more power to pressure these organizations. So if you're someone who's in a position of privilege where you feel comfortable talking to your parents, like do that.